The history of the enforcement of building and safety codes has been a slow and arduous process. Starting in the 20th century, society began placing a greater emphasis on the need for stronger and effective building codes and standards. In ancient Babylon, now current-day Iraq, the 5th century king Hammurabi laid the foundation for the earliest known laws, including the construction of buildings for its citizens. He wrote, "If a builder built a house for a man and completed it, that man shall pay him 2 shekels of silver per sar of house as his wage. If a builder has built a house for a man and his work is not strong, and if the house he builds falls in and kills the householder, that builder shall be slain." However, it was not until the Great Fire of Chicago in 1879 that the nation was galvanized to demand from city officials greater enforcement and regulations of code standards to ensure a higher level of public safety. The Great Fire of Chicago resulted in property damage worth $192 million. As many as 100,000 people were left homeless and 300 people dead.
Code development in the United States has been a very fragmented process, but it typically has developed in cycles of freewheeling construction followed by some tragedy or some event that prompted attention and then further development of the codes. And one example of that would be the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871.
People were being trapped in buildings because they didn't have 2 ways out of the building. And if one way out of the building, and you only had one way, was blocked by fire, you were stuck and incinerated. So codes began to implement rules such as you have to have 2 means of egress, 2 ways out of the building, just in case. There wasn't the kind of science and understanding of materials and what was flammable and what was inflammable that was part of the discussion either. There weren't sprinkler systems. And the understanding of safety with electricity as we began to wire buildings was very rudimentary. And so you had lots of cases of people dying unnecessarily that codes were trying to remedy.
All of a sudden in the United States, citizens and elected officials began focusing, as did the insurance industry, on the development of a model or standard code for building construction. So the National Fire Underwriters Association created a fire code basically around the turn of the century as a result of what happened with the Great Fire of Chicago.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the city of Nashville was experiencing the same growing pains that affected the rest of the country. The city issued a handbook titled Building Laws 1909. The book was 185 pages long, containing 1,302 ordinances. These ordinances addressed everything from electrical, plumbing, and building regulations to the qualifications required for becoming an inspector. At that time, Nashville had 4 inspectors. Over the next 35 years, the city would continue to issue revised editions of the original handbook in an effort to keep up with the growing demands of technology and innovation. In 1945, the Southern Building Code Congress issued the Southern Standard Building Code, which laid the groundwork for the modern code system practiced in Nashville today.
That began really what we know as modern code development or modern code enforcement in the United States. Prior to that time, everything was very fragmented. A city would have a code, a county would have a different code. A city in one end of the state would have one code, a city on the other end of the state would have a completely different code.
The need for the Southern Standard Building Code was further evidenced by the new Federal Housing Administration, created to accommodate the millions of servicemen and women returning to civilian life after World War II.
As World War II came to an end, Nashville was a relatively small city, although it was the capital city of the state of Tennessee. And it was located approximately in the center of Davidson County, which, although a rather large county, was very similar to the smaller counties around the state, some 95 of which had governments designed for a rural farm-type economy. But when World War II ended, beginning shortly thereafter, there were dramatic changes in Nashville and Davidson County. The city had many areas that were blighted and needing to be renewed. Urban renewal was the word, magic word of the century right at that point.
Federal government attention development of the Veterans Administration and Federal Housing Administration programs to house the returning servicemen, the attention that our government was paying to suddenly the population growth, the baby boomers were making their way through, and suddenly our population was expanding, new family formations, new need for housing, some growth, and the city began expanding its boundaries to provide for the growth and new family formations. So suddenly there was a much greater emphasis on codes administration, and there was a much greater emphasis in providing for the health, safety, and welfare of citizens.
Nowhere was there a greater need for providing for the welfare of its citizens in Nashville than in the area surrounding the state capitol. Here, building safety and health codes were non-existent. The area was comprised of 231 residential structures and 78 non-residential structures or small business establishments. Conditions were so bad that the federal government intervened in 1951 and provided financial assistance to the city of Nashville so that the residents in this area could be relocated to public housing in the hope of a better, safer, and healthier way of life.
They were largely tearing down old shanties and older housing properties, most of which had no restroom facilities within the homes, within the buildings. Almost all of those properties were served by outhouses, and that paralleled Nashville's attention to the development of a public sewer system.
In March 1952, the Nashville Housing Authority published the redevelopment plan for the Capitol Hill project. This pamphlet provided an extensive analysis of the geographic as well as demographic character of the district. It provided maps, street grids, as well as the racial, ethnic, and economic data.
Capitol Hill redevelopment project came along because there was a great number of substandard buildings that lined what is now James Robertson Parkway behind the state capitol. We had it was clearly a genuine slum. They had outdoor pit toilets, and right beneath the state capitol. So it was time to get rid of that. It was time to get these people relocated to standard housing and to do away with all those slums. That brought on the redevelopment district, which allowed the government to go in and take that land and to redevelop it basically as we see it today as James Robertson Parkway.
Before the renovation work of urban renewal could begin, a lawsuit was filed in the Third Circuit Court of Davidson County in December 1952. The lawsuit was filed against the Nashville Housing Authority on behalf of the Grand Lodge of the Knights of Pythias. The lodge was located on what would become James Robertson Parkway, which was within the area where the Capitol Hill project was to take place. Several small businesses were located there as well, and for them and the plaintiff, the issue was eminent domain.
There were those who felt that urban renewal projects were simply unconstitutional. You were taking somebody's land in order to provide for a new growth. But gradually, those urban renewal projects stood the test that were raised legally. And the courts decided that this was appropriate. The legislative authority that was given facilitated that, so that these old blighted areas could be cleared and removed and provide a new, more modern type of housing and other supportive structures.
Along with building safety, there was an increase in interest concerning public health issues that began to take place in Nashville as the population continued to grow. The concern for sanitary living conditions, its impact on the health of the community, and the ability to enforce these standards brought about a need for a codified set of regulations. In 1945, Dr. John J. Lentz was appointed as Nashville's health director. With a steady increase in Davidson County's population and a greater number of people living in close proximity to each other, Dr. Lentz campaigned to improve sanitary conditions to prevent the spread of diseases before they could reach epidemic proportions.
There was a period of time in Nashville's history that everybody pretty much had a private sewage disposal system, a septic tank and overflow system. But as we began developing more and more land and people living closer together, thus began the development of sewage systems. But early on, our sewage systems in Nashville were nothing more than public sewage piping. In fact, it was 1959 before the city of Nashville opened its first sewage treatment plant. So, you know, I don't have to paint a picture, but we were piping our raw sewage to our rivers and streams. As we developed our sewer systems in this city, we did that to control health issues associated, to control typhoid and cholera. We were thinking of the future, and all this thought process and all this development process began for Nashville, Tennessee in the 1950s.
On a cold autumn morning in 1952, a pre-dawn fire broke out at Hillsborough High School, burning it to the ground. It was a new and modern building located just outside the city limits in Davidson County. Designed to meet the needs of a growing population that continued to expand outward into the suburbs, it housed 800 students. The city of Nashville assisted the county by deploying firemen to help put out the fire, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. The school could not be saved. This incident exposed a growing problem that was taking place between the city and the county, and its ability to provide quality service and safety to its citizens. It also demonstrated the need for stronger building codes.
You know, when you get a fire that affects a school, obviously the city sends some equipment, but generally the city wouldn't send equipment out to the county. They knew where the county line was. So we got the sewer system, we got the fire, and I think that brought an awareness that we needed a better building code.
The burning of Hillsborough High School demonstrated the need for building and safety codes. It also showed how a community can be impacted when building and safety codes are not enforced. But the destruction of Hillsborough High uncovered another problem that was spreading throughout Davidson County in the early 1950s. As county officials began planning to rebuild Hillsborough High, there was a realization that the Green Hills suburb had grown so rapidly that septic tanks were no longer an acceptable way for the disposal of wastewater and sewage. Nashville Health Director John Lentz said that because of the increase in school activities at Hillsborough High, a proper means for the disposal of sewage was necessary. He warned that a major problem in the school system would exist if left uncorrected. This was followed by an editorial in the Nashville Tennessean that reiterated Dr. Lentz's warning that a public health hazard existed if Hillsborough High was rebuilt without the installation of an adequate sewage system to accommodate the new school. As the controversy over sanitary conditions at Hillsborough High continued to mount, C. Beverly Briley, elected county judge in 1950, declared that the time had come to develop a sewage disposal system countywide.
Because they wanted to build on the site, he saw this as an opportunity to start a sewage program for the county. And because of that thinking about, again, sanitary conditions, much like Capitol Hill, kind of a different reason, we had a big growth spurt in the nearby suburbs, Green Hills, Woodbine area, Donaldson, Bordeaux, those areas that were benefited from Beverly Briley's sewer system.
In the days in the late 40s, early 50s, even up into the 60s, until metropolitan government was fully in operation, that in education, in schools, the standards for the construction of schools, those standards were much higher inside the city of Nashville than they were out in Davidson County. And a good example of that is East Nashville High School, where I went to school. built in 1932, first graduating class in 1934, but in recent years completely restored, remodeled, but the building itself is still strong, well built from the beginning. And it probably was partially just a lack of sufficient funds. But the county system, the county schools, just were not built to the same standards. And I think that was investigated and a factor in the discussions after Hillsborough High School burned. The thought being, if more strict codes requirements had been in existence when that school was built, if higher standards of construction had been followed, that school might not have been the victim that it was of that fire. And when you have it happen at one location, then you think, are other areas equally vulnerable?
Despite Briley's successful campaign to improve the sewage water disposal system in Davidson County, there was a concern that the needs of the county had become too great to continue to operate effectively on its own. W.A. Pitts, City-County Planning Director, declared that the only solution to the 7th District and to Davidson County was an annexation by the city of Nashville. The door for annexation was opened when the Tennessee legislature amended the state constitution.
In 1953, the Tennessee Constitution was amended to provide the Home Rule Amendment. That amendment also provided for a consolidation of governments of a county and the principal city within that county. And Nashville and Davidson County was one of the first target areas for that to take place.
The Home Rule Amendment now provided the means necessary for the consolidation of county and city government. The impact that it would have on building and safety codes and its administration would be far-reaching. But before this could take place, a wary public had to be convinced that consolidation was in everyone's best interest.
Beverly Briley and Ben West and the city fathers at the time started meeting about forming a consolidated government. And this started in '58, actually. It came to, again, had to go to the legislature to get permission for a city and a county to consolidate. So they went to the legislature, they wrote enabling legislation for a metropolitan form of government where you would merge city and county functions. And Beverly Briley and Ben West and others were in support at the time.
However, a majority of Nashvillians were not ready for consolidation. In the final weeks leading up to the referendum, the tide turned in favor of the opposition. Despite its defeat at the polls, the supporters of a consolidated metropolitan government continued to press on. It was a growing movement that continued to gain converts.
After that, the mayor and the county judge and these city fathers continued to talk about it, continued to tweak the charter that they had drafted. They did a lot of polling, I'm sure, from the '58 election to find out why they didn't like it. So finally came up to another vote.
Then in 1962, a second referendum was held, and this time the public gave its endorsement. Continued growth in Nashville's population required the formation of a new governing body, capable of providing quality service and assistance to its citizens. In the area of codes administration, however, there did not exist a centralized authority capable of overseeing the regulatory needs of both the city and county.
As the growth of population occurred, and as buildings, houses and buildings were being built, as neighborhoods were being developed, streets and roads were being designed, and so on, there would be a need for a very detailed codes administration. As the charter was first adopted, those were gaps yet to be filled in. At a later time, a department of codes administration had to be organized and made a part of the structure of the local government, so that you had codes being adopted, being prepared, submitted through professional planners to the mayor and to the council for adoption, and put into a legal form.
A lot of the departments that were in the government at the time became charter departments, if you would. They were put into the charter. The charter set forth all cities operate under a charter to be a municipality. Metro Nashville, Davidson County took more of a look of a municipality than it did a county government. Although the charter said that if there was any conflict between the two, that you would use a municipal. So we looked more like a municipal government with its boundaries out to the county line.
The city's building inspection division was a portion of the city public works department, and they enforced a building code.
The health department did the functions of the plumbing code, if you would.
There was an electrical enforcement division that was separate even from those two. It was enforcing the electrical code for the city.
The city was a little more organized, and they actually had an inspections and permits department, but they didn't do zoning.
The county, on the other hand, really wasn't enforcing a building code. They were selling building permits. They had a building inspection division or department that sold building permits or construction permits, but largely they were enforcing their zoning code.
The Planning Commission actually issued building/zoning permits for the county, and and using the term building permits, using it loosely.
And all of these various divisions were enforcing parts and pieces of the code, and frankly were not coordinated. The building code wasn't coordinated with the electrical code or the plumbing code, and maybe it was coordinated and maybe not with the zoning code.
Simply stated, prior to 1963, there was no codes administration. Shortly after the establishment of metropolitan government in 1963, Mayor Beverly Briley and the council began laying the foundation for the creation of a codes administration. After several months of planning, in October 1963, they made their recommendation.
And the recommendation was the creation by ordinance, by city ordinance, of a Department of Codes Administration to effectively administer building codes, plumbing codes, electrical codes, housing codes, and the zoning codes for the city and county.
Codes Administration and the Codes Department played a major role in the orderly development of this city and county after consolidation took place. You now had the structure, you had the means of doing that, and you had a group of people who were concerned in the government and provision for the growth, for the economy, for the development on a countywide basis, recognizing that there were still many areas of the county in which was sparsely populated. That growth was taking place gradually, of necessity. But as it took place, you had the means of filling in those gaps and providing the kind of regulation that would be required for those things to be developed in a fashion that would be consistent and meet the needs of the people as that new development was taking place.
With the Department of Codes now firmly in place and unified under one umbrella, the next step was to appoint someone as director. Mayor Beverly Briley appointed W.A. Pitt as the first director of the Codes Administration. Pitt, formerly the city-county planning director under the old governing system, had the experience necessary to assume responsibility of this new and growing agency. However, after only 6 months as its director, Pitt died and someone was needed to take his place immediately. This responsibility fell to Bob Walker. It is Bob Walker who is credited with organizing the various entities into one unified department.
I think we have to give credit to Bob Walker for establishing the Codes Department, and most of the processes and policies and practices that many of which we still employ today. It was all about organizing city codes with county codes, electrical codes with building codes, and bringing it all together and coordinating it as a single effort. And Bob Walker did an extremely good job putting it together for Nashville, Tennessee.
At the time when, again, because of this consolidation, we still had 2 zoning ordinances, so we were continuing to enforce 2 zoning ordinances and distinguishing between the city and the county there, which was kind of a pain. But Bob Walker brought this together.
As the 1980s neared, tragedy as well as innovation would revolutionize the role of the Codes Administration in Nashville for the next 20 years.